Welcome to History Teller YT, where forgotten empires and legendary leaders come alive. Today, we dive into one of the most extraordinary and controversial stories in human history, the rise and legacy of the Mongol Empire. From the endless steppes of Mongolia to the grand palaces of China, from the ruins of Baghdad to the gates of Europe, this is the saga of Genghis Khan and his descendants. It's a story of unimaginable conquest and brutal destruction, yet also of innovation, global trade, religious tolerance, and cultural exchange that reshaped the medieval world. You'll witness the birth of a world-connecting empire, the terror of unstoppable armies, and the surprising ways in which Mongol rule transformed Eurasia forever. By the end of this journey, you'll see how one man's vision forged the largest land empire in history, leaving behind a legacy both feared and admired to this day. Stay with us, because once you begin this story, you'll want to hear it until the very end. Long before the Mongol Empire rose to dominate the world, the vast Eurasian steppes stretched endlessly from Manchuria in the east to the Hungarian plain in the west. This immense grassland was both harsh and fertile, a land where survival demanded resilience, mobility, and an iron will. Life on the steppe was defined by cycles of extreme weather, scorching summers, brutal winters, and scarce resources. It was a world where pastoral nomadism shaped culture. People lived in portable felt tents known as jairs or yurts, moved with their herds, and depended on horses for almost every aspect of survival. Horses were not merely animals, but lifelines, serving as mounts, sources of milk, and even food in desperate times. Among these scattered clans, loyalty was fragile and alliances shifted like the wind. Blood feuds between families could last generations, and chieftains held power only as long as they could command respect and secure enough followers. Yet this unforgiving landscape bred a unique strength, discipline, adaptability, and mastery of cavalry warfare. The Mongol tribes, fractured though they were, carried within them the seeds of a power that would one day shake the foundations of empires across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. This was the world into which a boy named Temujin was born in the year 1162, near the banks of the Onan River. His early life was destined to mirror the turbulence of the steppe itself: hardship, betrayal, and survival against overwhelming odds. Temujin's father, Yasujii, was a tribal leader who briefly united a small confederation through alliances and force. But when Temujin was still a boy, Yasujii was poisoned by rivals, plunging his family into despair. The widow Holon, Temujin's mother, suddenly found herself abandoned by their clan, left with her children to fend for themselves in a world that had little mercy for the weak. They survived by scavenging roots, fishing rivers, and hunting small animals, enduring starvation and humiliation. Temujin's childhood forged in him a fierce determination. He understood betrayal firsthand and vowed never to let disunity destroy him as it had his father's household. At one point, he was captured by a rival clan and enslaved, forced to wear a wooden collar and live as a servant. But through courage and cunning, he escaped, rallying a few loyal companions to his side. These experiences instilled in him both ruthlessness and loyalty, qualities that would define his later leadership. Temujin learned to value merit over lineage, rewarding those who proved themselves in battle rather than simply elevating aristocrats. This principle, radical in a world dominated by hereditary privilege, would eventually bind the Mongols under his rule. His youth was not one of privilege, but of scars, each hardship sharpening his vision of a future where he would never again be powerless. By his teenage years, Temujin began to understand that survival on the steppe required not just strength, but strategic alliances. He married Borte, his lifelong companion, forging a union that was as much political as personal. Borte's abduction by the Merkit tribe would later test Temujin's leadership as he rallied allies, including the powerful chieftain Togrul, known as An Khan, and his blood brother Jamukha, to rescue her. This victory elevated Temujin's reputation as a formidable and determined leader. Yet ambition soon clashed with loyalty. Jamukha, once his closest ally, turned into his bitter rival. Their struggle culminated in brutal battles, where Temujin's discipline and merit-based system contrasted with Jamukha's reliance on noble lineage. Although Temujin faced defeats, he persisted, gradually attracting warriors disillusioned with traditional clan politics. He reorganized his followers into decimal units, groups of 10, 100, and 1,000, breaking apart old tribal loyalties and creating a new order based on loyalty to him alone. By the turn of the 13th century, Temujin had gained enough momentum to be recognized as Genghis Khan, or universal ruler. His rise was not merely the story of one man's ambition, but the beginning of a revolution in steppe politics. He had turned fractured nomadic tribes into a disciplined war machine that would soon thunder across continents. When Temujin began his quest to unite the Mongol tribes, the steppe was plagued by a cycle of endless raids, revenge killings, and shifting loyalties. No chief could hold authority for long, because kinship ties and aristocratic claims mattered more than discipline or ability. Temujin recognized this as the greatest weakness of the steppe peoples. His answer was bold: to destroy the old tribal order and replace it with a new system where merit and loyalty to him outweighed bloodline. He reorganized his followers into military units called the decimal system. 10 men formed an Arban, 10 Arbans made a Jaghan, and so on until entire tumans of 10,000 men stood ready. This system broke apart tribal rivalries because warriors from different clans were mixed together under a single banner. It was revolutionary, forcing men who might once have been enemies to fight side by side. Alongside this, Temujin promoted individuals of talent regardless of their origin. A poor shepherd could rise to become a general if he proved his loyalty and skill in battle. In a world dominated by noble bloodlines, this principle made Temujin unique and deeply attractive to ambitious warriors. The Mongol tribes, accustomed to chaotic leadership, began to see in him not only a chief, but a visionary who promised a new order. His authority grew as warriors realized that under his rule, their fates were no longer tied to the whims of tribal aristocrats, but to a leader who rewarded success. By the late 12th century, Temujin's force was no longer just another clan. It was the seed of a new Mongol nation. Even as Temujin's power grew, his most bitter challenge came from Jamukha, his childhood companion and sworn blood brother. For a time, they shared dreams of steppe unity, but ambition drove them apart. Jamukha, proud of his aristocratic lineage, could not accept Temujin's radical merit-based system that threatened the privileges of noble families. Tensions exploded into open conflict in 1187, when Jamukha declared himself Gurkhan, supreme ruler of the Mongols. Temujin, in contrast, was elected Khan by his loyal followers, who saw in him a leader of destiny. Their rivalry erupted into a series of bloody battles. In one confrontation near the Onan River, Temujin's disciplined forces initially triumphed, but Jamukha soon struck back with overwhelming numbers. The result was catastrophic. Temujin's men were crushed, and in an act of terror, Jamukha executed 70 of his captured warriors by boiling them alive. This brutal act horrified many steppe tribes, pushing them away from Jamukha and into Temujin's arms. Temujin rebuilt patiently, recruiting new allies, promising fair treatment, and reminding warriors that loyalty to him meant honor and reward rather than the cruelty of aristocratic pride. This rivalry with Jamuka was more than a personal struggle. It was the clash of two visions of leadership. Jamuka embodied the old tribal system of blood and lineage, while Temujin represented a new meritocratic and disciplined order. Ultimately, Jamuka's reliance on noble privilege weakened him, and Temujin's vision endured. The war scarred Temujin, but it also proved his resilience. Defeat did not end his quest. It sharpened it, teaching him that patience, organization, and ruthless justice would eventually bring him absolute power. Temujin's perseverance eventually bore fruit. After years of shifting battles, alliances, and betrayals, he gradually drew more tribes under his banner. His reputation as a leader who rewarded merit, enforced discipline, and punished betrayal spread across the steppes. By 1201, his forces faced a grand alliance of rival tribes, but Temujin's discipline and strategy shattered them. He was relentless. Rivals who resisted were either destroyed or absorbed, while those who submitted were integrated into his growing army. Step by step, the steppe fell into his control. Finally, in 1206, a historic Kurultai tribal council was convened on the banks of the Onan River. There, before the assembled chiefs and warriors of Mongolia, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. This moment marked not just his personal triumph, but the birth of the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan now commanded not a loose collection of clans, but a united nation of disciplined horsemen ready to ride out into the wider world. The declaration was symbolic. No longer were the Mongols just another nomadic people destined to raid their neighbors. They were a force destined to conquer and rule. Genghis Khan's unification of Mongolia was one of the most remarkable political and military achievements in history. He had transformed a fragmented, war-torn land into the foundation of the largest empire the world would ever see. The steppe had produced conquerors before, but none with Genghis Khan's vision, organization, and ruthless will. The tribes of Mongolia were now one people under one ruler, and the world beyond the steppe had no idea of the storm that was about to break upon it. After uniting the Mongol tribes under his iron rule, Genghis Khan turned his gaze outward. His first target was the Xia Kingdom, a Tangut state located in northwestern China, controlling vital trade routes along the Silk Road. To Genghis, the conquest of Xia was both practical and symbolic. Practical because it secured wealth, supplies, and prestige for his warriors, and symbolic because it was the first real test of his newly forged empire. In 1209, he launched a campaign into Xia territory. The Mongols, masters of mobility, swept across the arid plains and deserts with terrifying speed. Their horse archers struck with precision, cutting off supply lines and devastating enemy forces. Genghis Khan's military genius lay not only in his army's discipline, but also in his willingness to adopt foreign technologies. During the Xia War, he employed Chinese engineers captured in earlier raids to build siege weapons, catapults, and battering rams that allowed him to overcome fortified cities. The Tangut rulers, shocked by the ferocity and adaptability of the Mongols, were forced to surrender. Instead of annihilating them, Genghis imposed tribute and military support, recognizing the value of their resources. This campaign demonstrated two key principles of Mongol warfare: absolute destruction for those who resisted to the end, but leniency for those who submitted early. Xia thus became both a vassal and a warning to future enemies. The victory established Genghis Khan's reputation as not just a steppe warlord, but a conqueror who could humble kingdoms beyond Mongolia. The world began to take notice. though few understood that this was only the beginning of a storm that would soon engulf Asia. Having subdued Xia, Genghis Khan now turned his attention to a far greater challenge: the Yuan Dynasty of northern China. The Jin were wealthy, powerful, and arrogant, ruling from their capital at Zhengdu, modern Beijing. For decades, the Jin emperors had viewed the Mongols as little more than unruly nomads, extracting tribute from them and dismissing them as uncivilized barbarians. But Genghis Khan, determined to reverse this relationship, launched his campaign in 1211. The Mongols, numbering around 60,000 horsemen, faced a Jin army claimed to be over 500,000 strong. Yet the Jin's vast numbers were hampered by corruption, poor leadership, and overconfidence. Genghis Khan exploited this ruthlessly. His cavalry feigned retreats to lure enemy forces into ambushes, surrounding and annihilating them. His commanders, particularly Subutai and Jebe, perfected the art of strategic deception, striking deep into Jin territory, cutting communications, and creating panic. By 1215, the Mongols had reached Zhengdu itself. The siege was brutal. Mongol engineers, aided by defectors, constructed siege towers and trebuchets, bombarding the walls day and night. Starvation gripped the city, and desperate citizens resorted to cannibalism. Finally, the Jin surrendered, paying massive tribute in gold, silk, and women. Genghis Khan accepted their submission, but true to his principles, he made it clear that betrayal would mean utter destruction. The conquest of the Jin was a turning point. The Mongols had proven that steppe warriors could defeat one of the most advanced and populous states in the world. It also gave them access to immense wealth, feeding the engine of expansion. For the first time, the Mongols tasted the riches of China, and they hungered for more. The early campaigns against Xia and the Jin dynasty were more than victories. They were laboratories of conquest. Genghis Khan learned and refined principles that would guide his empire's future expansion. First, he understood the importance of incorporating talent from conquered peoples. Engineers, administrators, and artisans captured in these wars were not executed. Instead, they were absorbed into the Mongol system, serving as tools to strengthen his empire. This pragmatic approach allowed the Mongols to overcome their own lack of technological sophistication. Second, he perfected psychological warfare. Before attacking a city, the Mongols often offered terms of surrender, promising safety for those who yielded. If the city resisted, however, the consequences were catastrophic: mass slaughter, enslavement, and total destruction. This reputation spread quickly, causing many cities to surrender without a fight. Third, the campaign cemented loyalty within his army. The riches of China were shared not only among his generals, but also distributed to ordinary warriors, reinforcing their devotion to him. In Mongol culture, the promise of wealth, honor, and status was a powerful motivator, and Genghis Khan ensured that victories were collective triumphs, not just personal glory. Finally, these wars gave the Mongols their first taste of empire, ruling not only nomads, but also millions of sedentary farmers and city dwellers. Governing such populations required more than raw power. It demanded administration, tribute systems, and laws. Genghis Khan began laying the groundwork for what would become the Yasa, his legal code, designed to regulate not just the army, but the entire empire. In short, the Xia and Jin campaigns transformed the Mongols from a tribal confederation into an imperial power. The lessons learned here would soon be applied on a far larger stage, against Central Asia, the Islamic world, and eventually Europe itself. By the early 13th century, Genghis Khan's power had grown beyond the steppes of Mongolia and the northern borders of China. His victories over the Xia and the Yuan Dynasty had provided his warriors with wealth, confidence, and valuable lessons in siege warfare. Yet the Mongol war machine was restless. Genghis understood that a united and disciplined army could not sit idle. Without constant campaigns, the bonds of loyalty and hunger for spoils would weaken. Thus, his gaze shifted westward toward Central Asia, a region that held both immense wealth and strategic importance. At the heart of this territory was the Khwarezmian Empire, a Muslim state stretching from Persia into Central Asia, ruling over key Silk Road cities such as Samarkand, Bokhara, and Urgench. The Khwarezmians were prosperous and well-placed, controlling trade routes between China, India, and the Islamic world. Initially, Genghis Khan did not plan war. In fact, he sought peaceful relations, sending envoys to establish trade and diplomacy. But this act of goodwill would lead to one of the most devastating wars in history. The Khwarezmian Shah, Allah ad-Din Muhammad II, suspicious and arrogant, gravely underestimated the Mongols. In 1218, he seized a Mongol trade caravan at Otrar, accusing them of espionage. The merchants were executed, and when Genghis sent diplomats to protest, one was killed and the others humiliated. To the Mongols, the killing of envoys was an unforgivable crime, a violation not just of diplomacy, but of sacred custom. Genghis Khan's fury was boundless. He vowed to punish the Shah in a campaign of annihilation. What followed was not just a war, but a cataclysm. The full force of Mongol vengeance unleashed upon one of the wealthiest empires of its age. In 1219, Genghis Khan led his army westward into Khwarezmian lands, commanding perhaps 150,000 troops, supported by brilliant generals such as Subutai and Jeeb. Their strategy was one of precision, speed, and terror. Instead of attacking head-on, the Mongols divided their forces, launching simultaneous strikes across multiple fronts, overwhelming the Shah's defenses. One of their first great targets was Bokhara, a jewel of the Islamic world, known for its mosques, libraries, and scholars. As the Mongols approached, defenders fled in panic, leaving only a small garrison. Genghis entered the city triumphantly, allegedly climbing to the pulpit of the main mosque and declaring that he was the punishment of God, sent upon them for their sins. Bokhara was looted, burned, and its people enslaved. From there, the Mongols moved to Samarkand, the Shah's prized city, defended by massive walls and an army bolstered by war elephants. Yet Mongol discipline and tactics proved irresistible. They isolated the city, cut off supplies, and used Chinese-engineered siege machines to smash the walls. When the defenders tried a desperate cavalry charge, the Mongols feigned retreat, encircling and slaughtering them. Samarkand fell after only a few days. The population was massacred or enslaved, artisans were deported to serve Mongol projects, and the city was left a smoking ruin. The message was clear: resistance meant total destruction. These victories broke the backbone of the Khwarezmian Empire, sending waves of terror across Central Asia and Persia. Shah Muhammad, overwhelmed by the scale of devastation, fled westward, abandoning his people, and would die in misery on an island in the Caspian Sea. The Mongols had not merely defeated an empire, they had erased its authority from the map with a single campaign. While Genghis Khan's main army was devastating the Khwarezmian Empire, he ordered two of his greatest generals, Subutai and Jeeb, to undertake a mission that would become one of the most extraordinary cavalry expeditions in history. Their task was twofold: pursue the fleeing Khwarezmian Shah Muhammad and explore the western lands that lay beyond Persia. The Shah, desperate and humiliated, fled across his empire, abandoning his subjects to Mongol wrath. Subbatai and Gebe chased him relentlessly through deserts, mountains, and cities, spreading terror wherever they passed. Though they never captured the Shah, he eventually died in obscurity on an island in the Caspian Sea. The campaign became something far greater. With approximately 20,000 elite horsemen, the two generals embarked on what was essentially a massive reconnaissance mission that carried them across Persia into the Caucasus and eventually deep into the steppes of Eastern Europe. Everywhere they went, they left devastation and awe. They defeated Georgian armies in the Caucasus, crushed various Persian cities, and subdued nomadic tribes along the Caspian shores. More importantly, they gathered priceless intelligence about the political divisions, geography, and military weaknesses of distant kingdoms. The mission revealed the brilliance of Mongol strategy. Even as the empire expanded, it probed constantly, preparing future campaigns by understanding enemies long before launching a full invasion. Subbatai and Gebe were more than commanders. They were the eyes and ears of Genghis Khan, ensuring that when a Mongol struck again, it would be with deadly precision. This pursuit, born out of vengeance against the Shah, transformed into a journey that opened the gateway for Mongol expansion into Europe. As Subbatai and Gebe pushed westward, they encountered fierce resistance from an unlikely alliance. In the Caucasus, a coalition of Georgians, Armenians, Alans, and Kipchak Turks assembled to block the Mongol advance. These forces, though numerically superior, lacked the unity and discipline of the Mongols. Subbatai and Gebe employed one of their most famous tactics, the feigned retreat. Pretending to be overwhelmed, the Mongols withdrew across difficult terrain, luring the Allied forces into pursuit. Once the enemy was stretched and disorganized, the Mongols wheeled around and struck with devastating force. The result was a crushing defeat for the coalition. The Alans and Kipchaks, bitter after betrayal, were massacred, while the Georgians and Armenians suffered terrible losses. This victory not only opened the way into the steppes north of the Black Sea, but also further enhanced the Mongols' reputation for cunning strategy. Subbatai and Gebe were masters of psychological as well as physical warfare. Their enemies learned that raw numbers meant nothing against discipline, speed, and deception. The campaign also demonstrated another key Mongol principle: divide and conquer. The Mongols encouraged rival tribes to turn on one another, offering alliances only to betray them when it suited their needs. By manipulating politics as skillfully as they wielded bows, the Mongols ensured that no coalition could stand long against them. Having shattered resistance in the Caucasus, Subbatai and Gebe were now poised to ride even further west, into lands few Mongols had ever seen. Their journey was not over. Its climax would come on the fields of Eastern Europe. In 1223, Subbatai and Gebe led their forces into the Ukrainian steppes, where they encountered the combined armies of the Kievan Rus principalities allied with Kipchak nomads. This was the first major clash between Mongols and the peoples of Eastern Europe. The Rus princes, underestimating the Mongols as mere raiders, pursued them without coordination. The Mongols repeated their masterful strategy of feigned retreat, drawing the Rus deep into hostile terrain. For 9 days, the Rus pursued, exhausted and strung out, until the Mongols chose their battlefield on the banks of the Kalkar River. There, in a sudden reversal, the Mongol cavalry turned and encircled the Rus forces. Chaos erupted. Units broke apart, communication collapsed, and the Allied army was annihilated. Chroniclers describe tens of thousands slain, with bodies littering the steppe. In a chilling act of cruelty, several captured Rus princes were executed by being suffocated under planks as the Mongols feasted above them. a grim display of psychological dominance. The victory at Kalkar River was not merely a battle, it was a message. Europe now knew of the Mongols, and fear spread across its lands. Yet Subbatai and Jeeb, their mission complete, did not remain. They withdrew eastward, rejoining the Mongol heartlands. The purpose of their expedition had been fulfilled. The Shah was dead, Central Asia lay broken, and the Mongols had tested Europe, proving its vulnerabilities. The Battle of the Kalkar River foreshadowed the storms yet to come. Subbatai, in particular, would return years later at the head of massive armies, leading campaigns that would shake Europe to its core. The reconnaissance in force had become legend, one of the most daring cavalry expeditions in history, stretching thousands of miles across hostile lands. Genghis Khan's empire was now not only vast, but also aware of the riches and weaknesses of Europe. The Mongol gaze had turned westward, and nothing would ever be the same again. While the Mongols are often remembered for their ferocity in battle and their devastating conquests, Genghis Khan's genius was not limited to warfare alone. He understood that the sword alone could not hold together the vast empire he was forging. Armies could conquer, but law and order were needed to govern. To achieve this, Genghis Khan created what became known as the Yasa, a code of law that bound his people under a single, universal framework. The Yasa was not a written constitution in the modern sense. Rather, it was a living code of decrees and principles announced by Genghis and enforced with uncompromising severity. Its origins were rooted in the customs of the steppe, but expanded to cover the needs of ruling cities, farmers, merchants, and soldiers alike. The Yasa emphasized loyalty, discipline, and unity above all. Treason, desertion, and betrayal were punished by death without exception. Theft, especially of livestock, was treated as a crime against the entire community, reflecting the nomadic dependence on herds. Yet the Yasa was not purely punitive. It also enshrined protections for trade, religious freedom, and even the rights of women within Mongol society. Merchants, for example, were guaranteed safety under Mongol protection, encouraging the revival of Silk Road commerce. Religious leaders, whether Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, or shamanic, were exempt from taxation, reflecting Genghis's pragmatic tolerance. Through the Yasa, Genghis Khan transformed a loose confederation of tribes into a disciplined imperial system. For the Mongols, the law was sacred because it came directly from the Khan, seen as the chosen instrument of eternal heaven, Tungri. To disobey the Yasa was not merely a crime. It was defiance against the divine order of the world. The Mongols had been nomadic herders, with little experience in governing cities or complex societies. Yet, Genghis Khan recognized that his empire could not rely on plunder alone. He began to construct an administrative system that was both practical and flexible, using talent from every conquered land. Captured officials, scribes, and scholars were not executed. Instead, they were placed in service of the empire. The Persians contributed administrators skilled in tax collection. The Chinese offered bureaucratic expertise, and the Uyghurs provided a written script that became the foundation of Mongol record-keeping. Genghis established postal stations, known as the Yam system, a network of relay stations spaced across the empire where riders could change horses and deliver messages at remarkable speed. This system allowed for rapid communication across vast distances, ensuring that the Khan could receive intelligence and issue orders from thousands of miles away. Taxation was reorganized to favor stability. Artisans and farmers who submitted peacefully were spared massacre and instead paid tribute in goods, labor, or taxes. To prevent corruption, Genghis often appointed outsiders to administer newly conquered lands, ensuring that no single ethnic group dominated the empire. Another hallmark of his administration was the principle of meritocracy. Just as he promoted warriors based on skill rather than birth, he extended the same to civil officials. A poor man from Central Asia could rise as high as a noble-born Mongol if he proved competent and loyal. This pragmatism helped bind the empire together. Conquered peoples saw opportunity rather than only oppression. The Mongols were thus not just destroyers, but also builders of an administrative machine that could govern the most diverse and sprawling empire the world had yet seen. The Yasa and Genghis Khan's administrative reforms created a paradoxical reality within the Mongol Empire. On one hand, the Mongols ruled with unparalleled ruthlessness. Resistance meant annihilation. Disobedience to the Yasa meant death, and betrayal was punished with horrors designed to terrify. Yet on the other hand, the empire offered remarkable stability, safety, and even fairness for those who submitted. This balance of fear and order was central to the Mongol legacy. Traders who once feared endless bandit raids found themselves protected under Mongol patrols. Caravans could travel from China to Persia with official passes guaranteeing their safety. Religious communities that had once suffered persecution under other rulers enjoyed freedom to worship as long as they obeyed imperial law. Women within Mongol society, though still bound by tradition, enjoyed greater rights than in many contemporary cultures. They could own property, manage households, and even influence politics in the absence of their husbands. Yet all of this prosperity and tolerance was backed by the shadow of terror. The destruction of cities like Nishapur and Urgench served as reminders of what awaited those who defied the Khan. In this way, Genghis Khan's governance was both carrot and stick, rewarding submission with prosperity, but punishing rebellion with extinction. This dual system allowed the Mongol Empire to stretch across continents without crumbling under its own weight. Unlike many conquerors, Genghis Khan was not satisfied with being merely a destroyer. He wanted to be remembered as a lawgiver and organizer who brought order to chaos. The Yasa, combined with the empire's administrative network, ensured that the Mongols were not just a wave of destruction, but a force that reshaped Eurasia into a more interconnected world. The empire's stability laid the groundwork for what historians later called the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative peace and flourishing trade across much of Asia. The initial Mongol campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire had shattered its backbone, driving Shah Allah ad-Din Muhammad II into a pitiful flight across Persia. Pursued relentlessly by Mongol detachments, the once proud monarch abandoned city after city, leaving his people defenseless. Finally, in 1220, he died in despair on a lonely island in the Caspian Sea, a fugitive king stripped of his throne and legacy. Yet the Khwarezmian resistance did not end with him. His son, Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu, emerged as a figure of both defiance and tragedy. Unlike his father, Jalal ad-Din showed courage and determination, refusing to bow before the Mongol onslaught. Rallying what forces he could, he fought a series of desperate battles across Persia, Afghanistan, and beyond. His resistance became a thorn in Genghis Khan's side, demonstrating that even in the face of overwhelming devastation, the human spirit could rise defiantly. But the odds were hopeless. Jalal ad-Din's resources were meager compared to the Mongols' disciplined cavalry and tireless pursuit. Time and again, his armies were scattered, his followers slaughtered, and his strongholds reduced to rubble. Yet he fought on, drawing admiration even from his enemies. Chroniclers tell us that Genghis Khan himself, after witnessing Jalal ad-Din's desperate stand, acknowledged his bravery, an honor rarely granted by the Mongol conqueror. Still, heroism could not save the Khwarezmian state. Jalal ad-Din was forced into exile, and his once mighty empire disintegrated into ruins, its cities burned, and its people enslaved. Persia had been transformed into a wasteland, scarred permanently by Mongol vengeance. Among the many horrors of the Mongol conquest, the fate of Nishapur stands as one of the most infamous. In 1221, this great Persian city became the site of a massacre so devastating that it echoed in chronicles for centuries. The tragedy began when a Mongol commander, Genghis Khan's son-in-law, was killed during the fighting around Nishapur. The news enraged Genghis Khan's daughter, who demanded a punishment so severe that it would forever be remembered. Genghis, who never tolerated defiance, granted her wish. The Mongols stormed Nishapur with overwhelming force, breaching its defenses and cutting down its defenders. What followed was not merely conquest, but annihilation. The city's entire population, men, women, and children alike, was systematically slaughtered. Chroniclers claim that as many as 200,000 lives were extinguished in a matter of days, though medieval numbers are often exaggerated. What is certain is that Nishapur was reduced to silence, its streets filled with corpses, its libraries burned, and its gardens trampled into dust. The Mongols even ordered the skulls of the slain to be piled into pyramids as grim monuments to their wrath. This was psychological warfare in its most extreme form. The destruction of Nishapur served as a warning to every city from the Middle East to India that resistance to the Khan meant not just defeat but extinction. Yet for all its brutality, the siege also reflected the Mongols' calculated strategy. By erasing Nishapur, they ensured that countless other cities would surrender without a fight, fearing the same fate. The massacre thus became both a human tragedy and a tool of empire, wielded by Genghis Khan to spread terror far beyond the battlefield. The Mongol conquest of Persia was not just a series of battles. It was a transformation that reshaped the region for generations. Entire cities such as Urgench, Merv, Herat, and Nishapur were destroyed or depopulated, their wealth stripped, and artisans deported to serve Mongol projects in Central Asia and China. Agricultural lands were ravaged, irrigation systems collapsed, and once prosperous regions were reduced to desolation. Chroniclers describe fields left barren, rivers clogged with bodies, and towns turned into ghostly ruins. Yet, amid the devastation, the Mongols also laid foundations for a new order. Genghis Khan's policies ensured that artisans, craftsmen, and scholars who survived were transplanted into the Mongol heartlands, enriching their empire with knowledge and skills. Trade routes were violently disrupted at first, but once pacified, they would later flourish under Mongol protection. Persia, once the seat of a proud empire, became a province of a far greater one, administered by Mongol governors who extracted tribute and enforced the yasa. The psychological scars, however, were deeper than the physical ruins. The terror of Mongol reprisals lingered in memory, shaping Persian culture and politics for centuries. Yet even in this devastation, seeds of resilience remained. Islam, deeply rooted in Persian society, endured, and its scholars would later help shape Mongol policies as the conquerors gradually adopted aspects of the cultures they ruled. The conquest of Persia revealed the paradox of the Mongol Empire. It was at once the destroyer of civilizations and the creator of a new Eurasian order. For Genghis Khan, Persia was not just another conquest. It was a brutal lesson to the world that his reach was limitless, his wrath unrelenting, and his empire eternal. After years of relentless campaigning across Central Asia and Persia, Genghis Khan turned his attention back to East Asia, where unfinished business remained. The Xia kingdom, though earlier subdued and made a Mongol vassal, had begun to defy Mongol authority. During the Khwarezmian campaigns, when Genghis demanded troops from Xia to support his war, the Tangut rulers hesitated and ultimately refused, believing that the Mongols were stretched too thin to punish them. This act of defiance sealed their fate. To Genghis Khan, loyalty was absolute and betrayal was intolerable. In 1226, he launched what would be his final campaign, a merciless assault on the Tangut state. By now, his armies were veterans of decades of conquest, hardened by victories against far stronger empires. The Mongols swept into Xia territory with devastating efficiency, using their mobility to bypass strongholds, cutting off supplies, and encircling cities. The Tangut defenders fought bravely, but they were no match for the Mongol war machine. City after city fell, often with massacres that mirrored the horrors inflicted in Persia. The Mongols employed Chinese siege engineers to bring down walls, while their cavalry ravaged the countryside, ensuring no resistance could regroup. The campaign demonstrated once again Genghis's ruthless principle. Those who submit may live, but those who defy will face extermination. The Xia rulers had gambled that the Mongols were too far west to return. They had miscalculated fatally. The Mongol offensive culminated in the siege of the Tangut capital, Zhongxing, modern Yinchuan. This city was heavily fortified and well supplied, but the Mongols had learned much from years of warfare against sedentary powers. They surrounded the city, cutting it off from reinforcements, and began a systematic assault. Siege engines hurled massive stones, flaming projectiles, and even diseased carcasses over the walls, creating chaos inside. Chroniclers describe the suffering of Zhongxing's people. Famine, disease, and despair spread as the siege dragged on. Eventually, the Tangut rulers realized their situation was hopeless and sued for peace. Yet for Genghis Khan, forgiveness was no longer an option. The betrayal during his western campaigns had enraged him beyond reconciliation. He rejected the pleas for mercy and ordered the extermination of the Tangut royal family and nobility. The Mongols stormed Zhongxing, unleashing a massacre that destroyed not just the city, but the very identity of Xia. Its libraries were burned, its aristocracy wiped out, and its name erased from history. The once proud kingdom was obliterated so thoroughly that centuries later, little trace remained of its existence. This was a chilling reminder of the Mongol strategy. Mercy was possible for allies, but betrayal brought annihilation. The destruction of Xia was both a punishment and a warning to all vassals. Submission must be permanent and unquestioning, or else the fate of Zhongxing awaited. It was during this final campaign against Xia that fate caught up with Genghis Khan. Accounts differ on the exact circumstances. Some claim he fell from his horse during a hunt and was fatally injured, while others suggest illness or even wounds sustained in battle. What is certain is that in 1227, the Great Khan, conqueror of nations and founder of the largest contiguous empire in history, died in his early 60s. His death was shrouded in secrecy. Fearing unrest, his generals concealed the news until the campaign was completed and Xia utterly destroyed. According to tradition, his body was carried back to Mongolia, and his burial place remains unknown to this day. Legends say that thousands of horses trampled the ground above his grave to erase all signs of it, and the soldiers who escorted his body killed anyone they met to preserve the secret. Genghis Khan's death marked the end of an era, but not of the empire he built. His vision of unity, discipline, and expansion had forged an unstoppable machine that his successors would carry forward. At his death, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the Caspian Sea, encompassing a diversity of peoples, religions, and landscapes unimaginable to earlier steppe rulers. Yet Genghis was not remembered only as a conqueror. To his people, he was the son of heaven, chosen by Tungri to rule the earth. To others, he was the scourge of God, a destroyer who brought cities to ashes. His dual legacy of destruction and unification ensured his place as one of history's most consequential figures. With his passing, the question loomed: who would inherit his mantle and carry forward the storm he had unleashed? The death of Genghis Khan in 1227 left not only a vast empire stretching from China to Persia, but also the immense challenge of succession. Unlike many monarchies of the time, the Mongols did not practice automatic inheritance through primogeniture. Instead, leadership had to be confirmed at a Kurultai, a great council of Mongol nobles and generals. This system ensured that the new Khan had legitimacy in the eyes of the ruling elite, but it also carried the risk of factional conflict. Genghis had many sons by his principal wife Borte: Joki, Chagatai, Ogedei, and Talyui. Each possessed ambition, loyalty to their own families, and competing claims. Joki, the eldest, had long been at odds with his father, partly due to rumors questioning his legitimacy, as he was born shortly after Borte had been abducted and rescued. Though Genghis never formally disowned him, the tension remained unresolved at the time of his death. Chagatai, fierce and outspoken, openly doubted Joki's right to rule and made it clear that he would never accept his brother as Khan. This left Ogedei, the third son, who was less quarrelsome, more diplomatic, and seen as a consensus candidate. Talyui, the youngest, temporarily assumed the role of regent after Genghis's death, guiding the empire through the critical period of mourning and transition. The decision about succession was not merely a family matter. It was a test of whether the Mongol Empire could survive its founder. The empire could easily have fractured into rival khanates, each loyal to different sons, had it not been for the deliberate steps taken by Genghis before his death and the political skill of his heirs. The struggle ahead would determine whether the Mongols remained a united force or dissolved into feuding clans like their ancestors. In 1229, 2 years after Genghis Khan's death, a Kurultai was held to decide the future of the empire. Mongol nobles, generals, and representatives from across the conquered territories gathered in Mongolia to deliberate. The meeting was a display of both tradition and raw political negotiation. The rivalry between Joki's descendants and Chagatai threatened to tear the council apart, but Talyui, acting as regent, played a critical role in guiding the decision. Joki himself had died in 1227, shortly before or after his father, but his sons, particularly Batu, still held influence over the western Mongol domains. Chagatai, the second son, pressed his claim fiercely, but his harsh temperament and open hostility toward Joki's line weakened his support. In contrast, Ogedei was widely regarded as moderate, pragmatic, and able to maintain balance between competing factions. His personality lacked the brilliance of Subutai or the ferocity of Chagatai, but his patience and fairness won him respect. Most importantly, Genghis Khan himself had designated Ogedei as his preferred successor, a fact that carried enormous weight among the Mongol elite. After much debate, the council proclaimed Ogedei Khan as the great Khan of the Mongols. The ceremony emphasized both continuity and divine legitimacy, invoking the eternal blue sky, Tungri, as the source of Mongol power. Ogedei's election preserved the unity of the empire at a critical moment, ensuring that the Mongols did not collapse into infighting. It also marked a shift in Mongol history. The empire was no longer the personal creation of Genghis, but an institution that could endure beyond him. The challenge now was for Ogdi to prove himself worthy of the title Great Khan and to expand and consolidate the empire further. And then Ogdi Khan inherited an empire that was vast but still fragile. The Mongols had conquered immense territories, but many regions were only recently subdued and revolts simmered beneath the surface. In China, the Yuan Dynasty still controlled large areas in the north. In Central Asia, rebellion brewed among conquered peoples. In the west, the legacy of the Khwarezmian resistance had not yet been fully extinguished. Ogdi's first priority was consolidation. He continued his father's policies of rewarding loyalty and merit, while also strengthening the administrative system. Under his rule, the postal relay system was expanded, tax collection became more organized, and laws were enforced with the same uncompromising severity as before. Unlike Genghis, however, Ogdi had a more open attitude toward luxury and sedentary lifestyles. He established Karakorum as the imperial capital, transforming it from a nomadic encampment into a city with palaces, markets, and temples representing multiple religions. This signaled a shift. The Mongols were no longer just conquerors of the steppe, but rulers of an empire that required urban centers and bureaucracy. Militarily, Ogdi continued expansion on multiple fronts. He launched campaigns against the Yuan Dynasty in northern China, pressing further into their territories. In the west, he ordered the continuation of campaigns into Russia and Eastern Europe, led by Subutai and Batu. These simultaneous offensives demonstrated that under Ogdi, the Mongols were not content with preserving their gains. They were determined to carry Genghis Khan's dream of world conquest even further. His reign stabilized the empire, but it also sowed the seeds of overextension. By holding the empire together after Genghis's death, Ogdi proved that the Mongol Empire was not a fleeting phenomenon tied to one man's charisma, but a durable power that could reshape Eurasia for generations. When Ogdi Khan assumed leadership of the Mongol Empire, one of his first priorities was to complete his father's unfinished wars. The Yuan Dynasty, ruling northern China, had long been the target of Mongol ambition. Genghis Khan had inflicted devastating defeats upon them, even sacking their capital Zhongdu in 1215, but the Jin state still survived. To the Mongols, leaving a wounded enemy standing was unthinkable. In 1230, Ogdi personally led a massive campaign against the Jin. This was no longer the swift strike of nomadic horsemen, but a carefully organized, multi-front assault involving hundreds of thousands of troops. The Mongols used their perfected strategy of mobility and encirclement, but also siege technologies adapted from Chinese engineers. Cities that once seemed impenetrable now fell one after another. The Jin tried to resist by leveraging their vast population, fortifications, and even alliances with the southern Song dynasty. Yet the Mongols exploited Jin weaknesses, corruption in government, disunity among commanders, and reliance on outdated strategies. In 1232, the Mongols besieged Kaifeng, the new Jin capital. The defenders used innovative weapons, including early forms of gunpowder bombs, which terrified the Mongol horses. Yet even this new technology could not stop the relentless siege. Disease and starvation ravaged Kaifeng, forcing the Jin to abandon the city. By 1234, after years of struggle, the Jin dynasty collapsed completely, its emperor captured and executed. For the Mongols, this was a monumental victory. They had eliminated one of the most powerful dynasties in China and secured control over vast stretches of northern territory. But the conquest also revealed the challenges of ruling sedentary populations far larger than the nomadic core of the empire. The victory over the Jin marked not only the fulfillment of Genghis Khan's ambition, but also the beginning of the Mongols' deeper entanglement in Chinese politics and administration. The destruction of the Yuan Dynasty brought the Mongols face-to-face with the southern Song Dynasty, which ruled the rich land south of the Yangtze River. Unlike the Jin, who had already been weakened by decades of Mongol assaults, the Song were wealthy, sophisticated, and technologically advanced. Their economy was the most prosperous in the world at the time, with bustling cities, vast rice paddies, and thriving trade networks. Initially, the Song had allied with the Mongols against the Jin, hoping to benefit from their enemy's downfall. But once the Jin were gone, the Mongols had little reason to respect the alliance. The Song soon realized that they had invited a far greater threat to their doorstep. The Mongols launched probing attacks into Song territory, testing their defenses. They encountered formidable challenges: well-fortified river cities, skilled use of gunpowder weapons, and the natural barrier of the Yangtze. Unlike the open steppes or deserts where Mongol cavalry excelled, the watery landscapes of southern China limited their mobility. Still, the Mongols adapted. They recruited Chinese engineers and defectors to build fleets of ships, enabling them to fight river battles. They also applied their classic strategy of psychological warfare, spreading terror through massacres in towns that resisted. However, full conquest of the Song would take decades and extend beyond Ogedi's reign. For now, the campaigns of the 1230s established Mongol presence in the north and created a long frontier where skirmishes and sieges became constant. The Song resisted fiercely, aware that surrender would mean destruction, but the Mongols were patient. They had already shown the world that no fortress, no dynasty, could resist them forever. The struggle with the southern Song marked the next great chapter of Mongol ambition in China. The Mongols' victory over the Yuan Dynasty was more than just a territorial gain. It was a turning point in world history. For centuries, steppe empires had raided China but failed to hold it. The Yuan defeat proved that the Mongols were different. They were not content with plunder alone, but sought to govern, administer, and reshape the lands they conquered. With the fall of the Yuan, the Mongols inherited millions of new subjects, including peasants, artisans, and scholars. They absorbed advanced Chinese technologies, from siegecraft to gunpowder, and incorporated Chinese administrators into their growing imperial bureaucracy. This cultural exchange strengthened the Mongols, making their empire not only militarily unstoppable, but also technologically adaptive. The conquest also highlighted the empire's dual character. To some, the Mongols were destroyers who left cities in ruins and populations massacred. To others, they were pragmatic rulers who brought stability and revived trade. Along the old Silk Roads, merchants now found safer passage under Mongol protection than under the corrupt and divided rule of the Yuan. The collapse of the Yuan also shifted the balance of power across Asia. Korea, which had been under Yuan influence, fell increasingly into Mongol orbit. The southern Song, once relatively secure behind the buffer of the Yuan, now faced direct pressure from the most formidable war machine on earth. For the Mongols, the conquest was both a triumph of arms and a statement of destiny. China itself was now within reach. Though the southern Song would resist for decades, the Yuan conquest demonstrated the inevitability of Mongol dominance. It was another step toward Genghis Khan's ultimate dream, a united empire stretching across the known world, from the Pacific to the heart of Europe. With the Yuan dynasty destroyed and China partly subdued, the Mongol gaze turned westward once more. Under the leadership of Baghdad Khan, the son of Joki, and guided by the brilliant General Subutai, the Mongols embarked on one of the most audacious campaigns in history, the invasion of Europe. Their first major target was the fractured world of the Rus principalities, located in what is today Russia and Ukraine. The Rus were a collection of city-states: Kiev, Vladimir, Ryazan, Novgorod, and others, often at war with one another and lacking any real unity. For the Mongols, this disunity was an invitation. In 1237, Batu launched the assault, beginning with Ryazan. The city was besieged and utterly destroyed after refusing to surrender. Chroniclers described days of massacre. The city burned to ashes and its people annihilated. This grim fate became the hallmark of the Mongol advance. One by one, the Rus cities fell. Kolomna, Vladimir, and Suzdal were devastated. In 1240, the Mongols struck at Kiev, the ancient and prestigious center of Rus civilization. Despite its proud history, Kiev was poorly defended and divided by internal rivalries. The Mongols stormed the city, slaughtering its inhabitants and leaving it in ruins. Survivors later described Kiev as a desert where not a single living soul remained. Subbutai's brilliance was evident throughout. He combined terror with precise strategy, ensuring that no Rus force could unite against them. The conquest of the Rus principalities was not merely a campaign of destruction, but also a strategic move. By shattering the Rus, the Mongols secured their eastern flank for deeper advances into Europe. The terror unleashed in Russia echoed across the continent, warning Europe of the storm now moving westward. With the Rus principalities subdued, Batu and Subbutai pressed their momentum further into Europe. Their armies advanced with terrifying speed in the early 1240s, striking simultaneously in multiple directions. In 1241, Mongol forces invaded Poland, where European knights, armed with heavy cavalry, believed they could withstand the nomadic horsemen. At the Battle of Legnica, a coalition of Polish forces, Teutonic knights, and other allies confronted the Mongols. Despite their courage, they were overwhelmed. The Mongols used their signature tactic of feigned retreat, luring the knights into a trap before encircling and annihilating them. The Polish army was destroyed, its commanders killed, and the Mongols moved on almost unhindered. But the true focus of the campaign was Hungary, a wealthy kingdom at the heart of Europe. King Bela IV had defied Mongol demands for submission, believing that alliances with European powers would save him. Instead, his defiance brought devastation. At the Battle of Mohi in April 1241, Subbutai executed one of his greatest masterpieces. The Mongols crossed the Sejo River at night using a secretly constructed bridge, flanked the Hungarian army, and trapped them in their camp. When dawn broke, chaos erupted. The Hungarian knights charged bravely, but they were crushed by Mongol arrows, smoke screens, and coordinated attacks. Tens of thousands were slain, and the Hungarian kingdom lay open to plunder. For a year, the Mongols ravaged Hungary, burning towns, massacring villages, and reducing the kingdom to ruins. Chroniclers described fields littered with corpses and churches filled with the dead. Europe trembled. No army seemed capable of stopping the Mongols, whose cavalry had crossed rivers, mountains, and plains with unstoppable ferocity. The invasion of Poland and Hungary was the closest Europe had come to total conquest. Just as it seemed that Europe itself would fall, the Mongol tide suddenly receded. In 1242, while Batu and Subbutai prepared to push deeper into Austria, Germany, and beyond, news arrived from Mongolia. The great Khan, Ogedai, had died. According to Mongol tradition, all princes of the royal line were required to return for a Kurultai to elect a new Khan. Obedience to this custom was absolute, even at the height of conquest. Reluctantly, Batu halted his campaign and withdrew. Europe was spared not by its own strength, but by the death of Ogedei Khan thousands of miles away. This retreat left behind a shattered landscape. Hungary and Poland lay in ruins. The Rus principalities were devastated, and Europe had seen the full horror of Mongol warfare. Yet the Mongols were not truly defeated. They had chosen to leave. This fact haunted European leaders. Chroniclers marveled at how swiftly the Mongols moved, how cunningly they fought, and how mercilessly they destroyed. Subutai, in particular, emerged as one of the greatest military minds in history. His campaigns stretching across Asia and Europe, his strategies studied for centuries. For Europe, the invasion was a narrow escape, but the shadow of the Mongols lingered. The Rus would remain under Mongol domination for over 2 centuries, paying tribute to the Golden Horde. Hungary, though rebuilt, carried scars of devastation for generations. The Mongols had demonstrated that even the mightiest kingdoms of Christendom could be humbled. The retreat in 1242 was not a European victory, but a Mongol decision, a reminder that the steppe horsemen could return at any time. The psychological impact was enormous. Europe now lived in fear of the East, of a storm that had once nearly consumed it. After the devastating European campaign of 1241 to 1242, the Mongols withdrew, but they did not abandon their western conquests. Instead, the lands of the Rus principalities and the steppes of Eastern Europe were organized into a new Mongol dominion known as the Golden Horde. This Khanate was ruled by Batu Khan, son of Joki and grandson of Genghis Khan. Batu established his headquarters along the lower Volga River, founding the city of Sarai, which would grow into a thriving capital of Mongol power in the west. Unlike the temporary raids that had terrorized Poland and Hungary, the Golden Horde represented permanent Mongol rule. From the mid-13th century onward, the Rus principalities became vassals, forced to pay heavy tribute to the Khan. Mongol officials, known as Baskaks, were stationed in cities to oversee tax collection, census taking, and enforcement of the Khan's authority. Though the Mongols did not directly occupy every corner of the Rus lands, their presence was absolute. Princes who resisted were executed, while those who cooperated were confirmed in their titles. The Mongols cleverly exploited the disunity of the Rus, playing rival princes against one another. This policy allowed them to maintain control without needing vast garrisons. The tribute extracted from Russia enriched the Golden Horde, funding Batu's court and Mongol campaigns elsewhere. Yet Mongol rule was not only about taxes and punishment. It also reshaped Eastern Europe's connections to the wider world. Through the Golden Horde, the Rus lands were tied into the Mongol network of trade routes stretching from China to the Mediterranean. Goods, ideas, and even technologies flowed more freely, though always under the watchful eye of Mongol power. The birth of the Golden Horde marked the beginning of 2 centuries of Mongol domination over Russia, a period that profoundly shaped its history. For the ordinary people of the Rus principalities, life under the Golden Horde was harsh and burdensome. Tribute payments were crushing, draining resources from already devastated regions. Entire communities were forced to provide not only money but also labor, livestock, and even conscripts for Mongol armies. The census, conducted with ruthless precision, ensured that no household escaped taxation. Yet Mongol rule also imposed a certain kind of stability. Once a city submitted and agreed to pay tribute, it was generally spared further destruction. This policy, a hallmark of Mongol governance, allowed economic life to recover slowly. Trade routes flourished again, protected by the Mongol military presence, and merchants found relative safety to travel long distances. The Mongols also introduced administrative practices borrowed from Persia and China, giving the Rus exposure to new systems of governance. Importantly, the Mongols generally did not interfere with the Orthodox Church. Religious leaders were often exempted from taxation, and churches were allowed to function freely. This policy strengthened the church's role in Rus society, as it became not only a spiritual refuge, but also a mediator between the people and their Mongol overlords. At the same time, the Mongols shaped the politics of the Rus principalities. Princes needed Mongol approval, known as the Yarlik, to rule, which created a culture of dependency on the Khan. Rivalries between principalities like Moscow, Tver, and Novgorod were often decided by which prince had better favor with the Golden Horde. Over time, this dynamic gave rise to Moscow's growing importance, as its princes became adept at cooperating with Mongol rulers while gradually building their own power. Thus, life under Mongol rule was a paradox. It was brutal and extractive, but also provided a framework within which the seeds of future Russian statehood began to grow. The impact of the Golden Horde on Eastern Europe was profound and long-lasting. For over 2 centuries, Russia remained under Mongol domination, a period later remembered in Russian history as the Tatar yoke. The Mongols shaped the political culture of the Rus, instilling traditions of centralized authority, heavy taxation, and military service that would echo in later Russian states. While the Mongols themselves eventually assimilated into Islam and developed a more sedentary lifestyle in their capital of Sarai, their presence permanently altered the balance of power in Eastern Europe. Western Europe spared direct conquest, often forgot how close it had come to destruction, but Eastern Europe lived with the Mongol shadow daily. At the same time, the Golden Horde connected Russia to the wider world. Through Mongol trade networks, goods from China and Persia reached Eastern Europe, while Slavic furs, honey, and slaves traveled eastward. This integration into Eurasian commerce helped shape the economic and cultural exchanges of the 13th and 14th centuries. However, the price was steep. The devastation of the initial invasions, combined with centuries of tribute, stunted the development of many Rus cities and left the region vulnerable to further foreign domination. Yet the Mongol period was not only destructive, it also accelerated the rise of Moscow. By skillfully managing relations with the Golden Horde, the princes of Moscow gradually consolidated power, using Mongol institutions of tribute collection to enrich themselves and strengthen their authority. In time, Moscow would lead the resistance that broke free from Mongol control, but the mark of the Golden Horde remained. Even in victory, Russia carried the legacy of Mongol influence in its autocratic traditions, in its military organization, and in its outlook toward both Europe and Asia. The Golden Horde thus left behind a mixed but undeniable inheritance. It was a regime of oppression, yet also a bridge that. In the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire was at the height of its power, stretching across Eurasia. With the West already shaken by Bada's Golden Horde, the Middle East now came into Mongol focus. The expansion into this region was led by Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan and brother of Monk, the great Khan who succeeded Ogdi's line. Hulagu's mission was clear: to extend Mongol authority into Persia, Mesopotamia, and the Islamic heartlands, destroying any force that resisted. This campaign was not a random raid. It was a calculated move to break the power of Muslim dynasties that might challenge Mongol supremacy and to bring under control the immensely wealthy trade routes linking east and west. Hulagu gathered a massive army, one of the largest Mongol forces ever assembled, including not only Mongol horsemen, but also Chinese siege engineers, Persian auxiliaries, and even Christian allies from the Crusader states and Armenia. The first great target was the Assassins, the feared Nizari Ismaili sect based in the mountains of Persia. Known for their secretive operations and targeted killings of rulers, the Assassins had terrorized the region for generations. Hulagu besieged their mountain fortresses one by one, using overwhelming firepower and psychological terror. In 1256, their stronghold of Alamut fell, and the Assassin Order was shattered. With this threat eliminated, Hulagu turned his attention to a far greater prize: Baghdad, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, the symbolic heart of Islam. For centuries, Baghdad had been a center of learning, trade, and culture, renowned as the City of Peace. To the Mongols, however, it was an empire to be broken, its caliph reduced to a subject, or destroyed if he resisted. Hulagu marched west, and the Islamic world trembled before the storm gathering at its gates. In 1258, Hulagu's vast army arrived at the walls of Baghdad, a city that had once been the jewel of the Islamic Golden Age. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim, however, gravely underestimated the Mongols. Believing the city's defenses and divine favor would protect him, he made no serious preparations, spurning Hulagu's demand for surrender. This arrogance sealed Baghdad's fate. The Mongols encircled the city, cutting off supplies and communications. Chinese and Persian engineers constructed massive siege engines, catapults, mangonels, and trebuchets that hurled stones, fire, and missiles into the city day and night. After weeks of relentless bombardment, Baghdad's defenses crumbled. The Mongols stormed in, and what followed was one of the most infamous massacres in world history. For days, the city was subjected to systematic destruction. Chroniclers report that hundreds of thousands of people were killed, men, women, and children alike. The great libraries, including the House of Wisdom, were looted and burned. Priceless manuscripts, the accumulated knowledge of centuries, were thrown into the Tigris River, which was said to run black with ink and red with blood. Mosques, palaces, and markets were reduced to rubble. Even the caliph was not spared. Al-Mustasim was executed, reportedly rolled into a carpet and trampled by horses so that his blood would not touch the earth. The fall of Baghdad was not just the destruction of a city. It was the symbolic end of the Abbasid Caliphate as a political power. The Islamic world, once united under Baghdad's leadership, now stood fragmented and humiliated. Hulagu's conquest sent shockwaves from Cairo to Constantinople, proving that no city, however holy or powerful, was beyond Mongol reach. The sack of Baghdad in 1258 was more than a military victory. It was a civilizational rupture. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had once represented the unity of the Muslim world, was obliterated. Though later caliphs would be installed in Cairo under Mamluk protection, they were mere figureheads with no real authority. The destruction of Baghdad ended centuries of intellectual and cultural flourishing, scattering scholars, scientists, and poets across the region. To Muslims, the Mongols became a symbol of divine punishment, the scourge of God sent to humble the faithful. Yet the Mongol victory also brought unintended consequences. The sheer brutality of Baghdad's destruction horrified many, including some within the Mongol ranks, and Hulagu's ruthlessness alienated potential Muslim allies. The Mongols' Christian allies from Armenia and the Crusader states briefly celebrated the fall of Islam's heartland, but their triumph was short-lived. Within a few years, the Mongols faced their first major defeat at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, where the Mamluks of Egypt halted their advance into Syria. Still, Hulagu retained control over Persia and Mesopotamia, founding the Ilkhanate, one of the major successor khanates of the Mongol Empire. This new realm integrated Persian administrators and Islamic culture into Mongol governance, laying the groundwork for a fusion of steppe militarism with Middle Eastern traditions. The fall of Baghdad, thus, stands as a paradox. It marked both the peak of Mongol terror and the beginning of their assimilation into the Islamic world. To the wider world, it was proof that the Mongols were not merely raiders, but a force capable of reshaping civilizations, for better and for worse. From China to Europe, rulers now understood that the Mongol storm was not spent, and that its fury could fall upon any kingdom that defied it. After the sack of Baghdad in 1258, Kublai Khan consolidated his conquests in Persia and Mesopotamia, laying the foundation for what became known as the Ilkhanate. This new Mongol state, one of the four great successor khanates of the Mongol Empire, encompassed modern-day Iran, Iraq, parts of Turkey, and the Caucasus. Kublai ruled as an Ilkhan, or subordinate Khan, technically acknowledging the authority of the Great Khan in Mongolia, but in practice exercising independent control. The Ilkhanate represented a significant turning point in Mongol history. It was the first time that Mongols established a long-term government over the Islamic heartlands, blending their steppe traditions with Persian administrative systems. Kublai retained the Mongol principle of meritocracy, but relied heavily on local Persian officials to manage taxation, record-keeping, and agriculture. The Mongols, originally pastoral nomads with little experience in urban governance, came to depend on these Persian administrators, who in turn adapted Mongol policies to Islamic traditions. Sarai on the Volga might have been the capital of the Golden Horde, but in the Ilkhanate, cities like Tabriz became vibrant centers of power. The Ilkhanate's rulers inherited a land devastated by conquest. The irrigation canals were destroyed, farmlands depopulated, and trade routes disrupted, but they began the long process of recovery. Kublai himself remained a Buddhist and showed preference to Christian allies, sparking tensions with his overwhelmingly Muslim subjects. Yet the Mongols in Persia quickly realized that to rule effectively, they could not remain outsiders forever. This recognition set the stage for one of the most dramatic transformations in Mongol history, the gradual embrace of Islam by Hulagu's successors. The Ilkhanate faced a fundamental dilemma in its early decades. The ruling elite were largely non-Muslim. Mongols practicing traditional shamanism, Buddhism, or in some cases Christianity, while the population they governed was overwhelmingly Muslim. This created a gulf between ruler and ruled. Hulagu's destruction of Baghdad and execution of the caliph had outraged Muslims everywhere, and his preference for Christian allies deepened resentment. However, pragmatic necessity forced the Mongols toward accommodation. Persian administrators, many of them Muslim, were indispensable for governance. They re-established tax systems, restored irrigation, and ensured the flow of revenue to Mongol coffers. Over time, Mongol rulers began to see Islam not only as a potential unifying force, but also as a means of gaining legitimacy among their subjects. Still, the road to assimilation was rocky. Early Ilkhans often clashed with neighboring Muslim powers, particularly the Mamluks of Egypt, who had dealt the Mongols their first major defeat at Ain Jalut. The rivalry between the Ilkhanate and the Mamluks defined Middle Eastern politics for decades, with battles fought across Syria and Anatolia. Despite this hostility within the Ilkhanate itself, gradual cultural blending took place. Mongol princes began to intermarry with Persian families, while Persian culture, its art, architecture, and literature profoundly influenced Mongol rulers. The Mongols introduced their military strength and steppe discipline, while Persian traditions of administration and Islamic law seeped into governance. This coexistence was uneasy, but laid the groundwork for transformation. The Ilkhanate was no longer simply a foreign conqueror. It was becoming an Islamic Mongol state. The decisive shift came under Genghis Khan, who reigned from 1295 to 1304. A descendant of Hulagu, Genghis converted to Islam and declared it the official religion of the Ilkhanate. His conversion marked a turning point in Mongol rule, transforming the Ilkhanate from a foreign-dominated power into a state rooted in the culture and faith of its people. Genghis was not a passive convert. He actively promoted Islam while also maintaining the Mongol traditions of law and order. He reformed the tax system, ensuring fair distribution and reducing corruption. He rebuilt agricultural infrastructure, restoring irrigation canals and encouraging cultivation to recover from the devastation of earlier wars. Genghis also supported scholarship, architecture, and the arts, blending Mongol and Persian traditions into a new synthesis. Under his reign, the Ilkhanate experienced a cultural flowering, with Tabriz emerging as a cosmopolitan center of learning and trade. His embrace of Islam also reshaped foreign relations. Though the Ilkhanate remained hostile to the Mamluks, it now shared the faith of its Muslim neighbors, reducing the sense of alien occupation. Genghis' reforms stabilized the Ilkhanate and gave it legitimacy, but his successors struggled to maintain the same balance. Internal disputes and external pressures gradually weakened the state. By the mid-14th century, the Ilkhanate fragmented, leaving behind smaller successor states. Yet its legacy endured. The Mongols in Persia had ceased to be outsiders and had become part of the Islamic world. The Ilkhanate, thus, stands as a unique chapter in Mongol history, a bridge between the steppes of Central Asia and the cultural richness of the Middle East, where conquerors became rulers and foreigners became Muslims. Among Genghis Khan's grandsons, none left a legacy as influential as Kublai Khan. Born in 1215, Kublai was the son of Talyui and thus a direct heir to Genghis's bloodline. Unlike many Mongol princes who remained deeply tied to steppe traditions, Kublai showed an early fascination with Chinese culture. He studied Confucian philosophy, employed Chinese scholars, and demonstrated a vision that went beyond raiding and conquest. His rise, however, was not straightforward. After the death of Monk Khan in 1259, the empire was thrown into civil strife. The Mongols faced a succession crisis. Different factions supported different claimants for the title of Great Khan. Kublai's main rival was his brother Erik Bok, who represented the more traditional Mongol aristocracy and insisted on maintaining nomadic ways. A bloody civil war erupted between the brothers from 1260 to 1264. Kublai, supported by resources from northern China and by allies drawn from sedentary populations, ultimately triumphed. His victory marked a turning point in Mongol history. By defeating Erik Bok, Kublai shifted the center of Mongol power from the open steppe to the cities and farmlands of China. He proclaimed himself Great Khan in 1260, though in reality, his authority was contested by rival branches of the family, such as the Chagatai Khanate and the Golden Horde. Nevertheless, Kublai's position was strong and his vision clear. He would rule not merely as a steppe Khan, but as a Chinese emperor, blending Mongol traditions with Chinese statecraft. This ambition set the stage for the creation of the Yuan Dynasty, one of the most remarkable experiments in world empire. Kublai Khan's greatest achievement was the conquest of the southern Song dynasty, the last stronghold of Chinese resistance. The Song ruled the wealthy and populous land south of the Yangtze River, boasting advanced cities, powerful navies, and innovative gunpowder weapons. For decades, they had resisted Mongol incursions, but under Kublai, the Mongols launched a relentless campaign to bring them down. Kublai combined traditional Mongol cavalry with Chinese siege engineers and even naval forces. He He recruited shipbuilders from conquered lands and created a fleet capable of challenging Song dominance on rivers and seas. Step by step, Mongol armies pushed deeper into Song territory, capturing key strongholds. The final blow came in 1279 at the Battle of Yamen, where the last Song fleet was annihilated. The young Emperor Bing, only a child, drowned as his loyal minister leapt into the sea with him, ending the dynasty. With this victory, Kublai proclaimed the establishment of the Yuan Dynasty, ruling as Emperor of China. He adopted a Chinese dynastic title, building a new capital at Kanbalik, modern Beijing, which became the political and cultural center of his empire. Yet Kublai was careful not to abandon his Mongol heritage. While he presented himself as a Confucian emperor to the Chinese, he maintained the Yasa laws and steppe traditions for his Mongol elite. His administration thus reflected a dual identity: Mongol conquerors ruling through Chinese institutions. The Yuan Dynasty marked the first time that all of China had been united under foreign rule, a testament to the Mongols' adaptability and ambition. Kublai's conquest of Song was not just a military triumph, but a political transformation, integrating China into the heart of the Mongol world empire. As emperor of the Yuan Dynasty, Kublai Khan sought to rule China effectively, balancing Mongol dominance with Chinese traditions. He adopted many features of Chinese governance, including Confucian rituals, bureaucratic examinations, and centralized administration. Yet he also preserved a clear social hierarchy, with Mongols at the top, followed by Central Asians, then Northern Chinese, and finally Southern Chinese at the lowest tier. This division created resentment, but it also ensured Mongol control over a vast and often restive population. Kublai promoted trade and cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. Under his rule, the Silk Road flourished, linking China with Persia, India, and even Europe. Merchants and travelers came to his court, the most famous being Marco Polo, whose accounts introduced Europe to the splendors of Kublai's empire. The Yuan capital, Kanbalik, dazzled visitors with its grand palaces, bustling markets, and diverse population. Religiously, Kublai was tolerant. He supported Buddhism, allowed Islam and Christianity to flourish, and respected Taoism and Confucianism. This pluralism reflected the Mongol principle of pragmatic governance. Yet challenges abounded. The Yuan court faced corruption, inflation, and natural disasters that strained legitimacy. Efforts to expand beyond China proved costly and often disastrous. Mongol fleets sent against Japan in 1274 and 1281 were destroyed by typhoons, remembered as the kamikaze or divine winds. Campaigns in Vietnam, Java, and Burma met with resistance and heavy losses, draining resources. Within China, resentment of Mongol privilege simmered, particularly among the Han Chinese majority. Still, Kublai's reign represented the height of Mongol power in East Asia. His dynasty brought unity, prosperity, and international prestige, but it also sowed the seeds of future decline. The Yuan dynasty stood as both a symbol of Mongol adaptability and a reminder that even the greatest conquerors could not eat. By the late 13th century, after decades of conquest from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea, the Mongol Empire presided over the largest contiguous land empire in world history. But conquest was only part of the story. Once the great campaigns had ended and the Khanate stabilized, a new age began, what historians call the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace. This was not peace in the sense of an absence of war. Mongol armies still fought rebellions and border skirmishes, but it was peace in the sense that for the first time in centuries, much of Eurasia was united under a single imperial framework. Roads that had once been treacherous due to bandits or warring kingdoms were now patrolled by Mongol soldiers. Caravans could travel from China to Persia with official passes guaranteeing safety. The Yam system, the relay network of horses and stations, stretched across the empire, making communication and transport astonishingly fast for the medieval world. Merchants who once risked death crossing deserts or mountains now found secure passage under Mongol banners. The empire's pragmatism also extended to diplomacy. The Mongols sent envoys as far as Europe, offering alliances against mutual enemies like the Muslim Mamluks, while welcoming Christian missionaries and diplomats into their courts. To the east, Chinese silk and porcelain moved westward. To the west, Persian glass, Indian spices, and Arab textiles flowed eastward. Even more importantly, ideas traveled along these routes. Technologies like gunpowder and paper-making spread westward, while artistic influences and medical knowledge traveled east. The Mongol Empire, once feared as a force of destruction, became a bridge between civilizations. The Pax Mongolica created a unique historical moment where the world felt more connected than ever before. The Mongols did not invent the Silk Road, but they revitalized it on a scale unseen before or since. Under their rule, merchants enjoyed unprecedented freedom and protection. The Khans recognized that trade was not merely economic, it was political. A prosperous merchant class tied together distant parts of the empire and enriched the Mongol treasury. Cities along the Silk Road, such as Samarkand, Bokhara, Kashgar, and Tabriz, flourished as hubs of commerce and culture. Caravans brought silk, spices, and gems from the east, while wool, furs, and metals moved from the west. Luxury goods once rare in Europe, like Chinese porcelain or Persian carpets, now became coveted commodities. Beyond material wealth, the Silk Road became a highway of knowledge. Chinese innovations such as the compass, printing techniques, and advanced medicine traveled westward, while Islamic astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy moved east. The Mongol policy of religious tolerance created a cosmopolitan environment in these cities. Muslim scholars debated with Buddhist monks. Nestorian Christians served as translators in Mongol courts. Jewish merchants facilitated trade. Even Europeans found a place. Italian merchants from Genoa and Venice established colonies in Black Sea ports, linking Mediterranean markets to Asian supply chains. The most famous traveler of this era was Marco Polo, whose journeys through the Mongol Empire revealed to Europe the wealth and sophistication of the East. He described the grandeur of Kublai Khan's court, the bustling markets of Yuan China, and the safety of travel under Mongol rule. While his accounts were sometimes embellished, they captured the essence of the Pax Mongolica, a world astonishingly interconnected for the 13th and 14th centuries. This flourishing of trade and culture under Mongol protection transformed Eurasia into a single web of exchange, an achievement unmatched until the rise of modern global empires. For all its achievements, the Pax Mongolica was fragile. The very forces that enabled the Mongol Empire's prosperity, its vast size, cultural diversity, and reliance on communication, also made it vulnerable. Unity among the Khanates was more symbolic than practical. By the mid-13th century, the empire had already fragmented into four major realms: the Yuan Dynasty in China under Kublai, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia and Eastern Europe. Each Khanate recognized the nominal authority of the Great Khan, but in practice, they pursued their own interests. Still, as long as the Mongol rulers cooperated, trade and travel remained secure. Yet rivalries began to emerge. The Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate, for example, were bitter enemies, clashing repeatedly along their borders. Religious differences also played a role. While the Ilkhans gradually embraced Islam, the Golden Horde became Muslim earlier and more decisively, while the Yuan court in China remained Buddhist and shamanic. These tensions threatened the stability of the Pax Mongolica. Moreover, external pressures began to erode the empire's security. The Mamluks of Egypt blocked Mongol expansion into the Middle East, defeating them at Ain Jalut in 1260. In China, resistance simmered beneath the surface of Mongol dominance. And in Europe, the memory of Mongol invasions lingered as a source of fear and caution. Perhaps the greatest threat, however, was disease. The very trade routes that carried silk and spices also carried the Black Death in the mid-14th century, spreading devastation across Asia and Europe. Ironically, the same Mongol networks that connected the world also facilitated one of its worst pandemics. The Pax Mongolica was thus a double-edged sword. It brought unprecedented connection and prosperity, but its unity was precarious, vulnerable to division, war, and plague. Still, for nearly a century, it stood as proof that even an empire born in fire and conquest could create an era of peace and exchange. Although Kublai Khan's establishment of the Yuan Dynasty in 1271 marked the high point of Mongol power in East Asia, the dynasty was built on fragile foundations. From the start, Mongol rulers faced the enormous challenge of governing a population far larger and more sophisticated than their nomadic homeland. To secure power, Kublai instituted a strict hierarchy that placed Mongols at the top, followed by Central Asians, Northern Chinese, and finally Southern Chinese at the lowest level. While this helped maintain Mongol dominance, it also fostered deep resentment among the Han majority. Many felt alienated in their own country, fueling simmering hostility that grew over generations. The Mongols also struggled with the practicalities of administration. They had adopted many Chinese institutions, but did not fully integrate into Confucian traditions of governance. Court corruption worsened as officials enriched themselves, while the empire's finances grew increasingly strained. Kublai's costly military campaigns, particularly his disastrous invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281, and failed expeditions to Vietnam, Java, and Burma, drained the treasury and eroded the aura of Mongol invincibility. At the same time, natural disasters compounded the dynasty's troubles. Floods, famines, and plagues devastated the countryside, and the government's inability to provide relief further discredited Mongol rule. By the early 14th century, cracks had begun to appear. Local rebellions erupted, banditry spread across provinces, and Chinese intellectuals increasingly portrayed the Mongols as illegitimate foreign rulers. The very forces that had allowed the Mongols to conquer China, discipline, adaptability, and terror, were now weakened by decadence, overextension, and a sheer difficulty of holding such a vast and diverse land together. The seeds of Yuan decline had been sown long before their final collapse. As the 14th century progressed, the Yuan dynasty faced mounting crises that exposed its weaknesses. Successive rulers after Kublai lacked his vision and authority. Many were young or ineffective, manipulated by powerful ministers or court factions. The Mongol elite grew increasingly decadent, preferring the luxuries of Chinese palaces to the harsh discipline of the steppe. Meanwhile, ordinary people bore the burden of oppressive taxation, corruption, and forced labor. Social tensions erupted in waves of rebellion. Secret religious societies, often blending Buddhist and Taoist traditions, became rallying points for resistance. The most famous of these was the Red Turban Rebellion, which began in the 1350s. Sparked by famine, plague, and anger at Mongol oppression, The red turbans drew support from peasants, scholars, and former soldiers alike. They combined religious prophecy with nationalist fervor, declaring that the Yuan had lost the mandate of heaven, the traditional justification for Chinese rulers. The rebels captured cities, disrupted trade, and challenged Mongol authority across the empire. At the same time, Mongol power outside China was also fracturing. The once unified empire had splintered into rival khanates, the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, and the Chagatai Khanate, each pursuing its own ambitions. Without strong unity at the center, the Yuan were increasingly isolated. As rebellions spread and internal divisions deepened, the dynasty lost its grip on the provinces. By the 1360s, large swathes of China were effectively out of Mongol control. The rebellion was not just a political uprising, but a cultural rejection of foreign rule, as Chinese identity reasserted itself against Mongol domination. The Mongols had conquered China with fire and steel, but they could not extinguish centuries of Chinese tradition and resilience. The final blow to the Yuan Dynasty came in the 1360s and 1370s, when the Red Turban movement gave rise to a charismatic leader, Zhu Yuanzhang. Born into poverty, orphaned by famine, and once a Buddhist monk, Zhu embodied the suffering and resilience of the Chinese people under Mongol rule. Through military skill, political acumen, and sheer determination, he rose to command a formidable army. His forces captured Nanjing, which became his base, and from there, he expanded his control over southern China. By uniting disparate rebel groups under his leadership, Zhu transformed the rebellion into a national liberation movement. In 1368, Zhu declared the founding of the Ming Dynasty, taking the throne as the Hongwu Emperor. That same year, Ming forces marched north and captured Kambalik, Beijing, the Yuan capital. The Mongol court fled back to the steppe, abandoning their dreams of ruling China. The Yuan dynasty had fallen. The Mongols who remained in Mongolia continued to claim the Yuan title, but in China proper, the Ming restored native rule. The fall of the Yuan was more than just the collapse of a dynasty. It marked the end of Mongol dominance in East Asia. The Chinese celebrated the restoration of their culture, traditions, and autonomy, while the Mongols retreated to their homelands, diminished but not entirely broken. The Yuan's downfall illustrated the paradox of Mongol rule. They had conquered China with unmatched brilliance, but governing it proved beyond their long-term capacity. Their legacy in China was complex. On one hand, devastation, resentment, and foreign domination. On the other, innovations in trade, communication, and cultural exchange that left lasting marks. With the rise of the Ming, China entered a new era, but the memory of Mongol rule endured as both a warning and a lesson in the challenges of empire. The Mongol Empire, at its height, was the largest contiguous empire in human history, stretching across Eurasia. Its vastness was also its weakness. Even before the death of Kublai Khan in 1294, the empire was already showing signs of fragmentation. The sheer size of the territory made centralized rule impossible. Communication, though advanced for the time with the Yam postal system, still required weeks or months. Different regions had different needs. China required bureaucratic administration. Persia demanded integration with Islamic traditions, and the Russian steppes relied on tribute and intimidation. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol realm had effectively split into four major khanates: the Golden Horde in Eastern Europe and Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, and the Yuan Dynasty in China. Though they all claimed loyalty to the Great Khan in theory, in practice they acted independently. The descendants of Genghis Khan no longer gathered in Kurultais to elect a universally recognized leader, and rival branches of the family often fought against one another. This shift from unity to division was inevitable. The empire had been built on conquest, not on sustainable governance across such diverse lands. Each khanate reflected its environment. Golden Horde rulers adopted Islam and steppe traditions. Ilkhanate rulers embraced Persian culture, and Yuan emperors adapted Chinese statecraft. The Mongols had conquered the world, but now they were becoming part of it, transforming into Persians, Chinese, Turks, and Russians. This transformation ensured survival in some regions, but made unity impossible. The Golden Horde, founded by Baghdad Khan after the conquest of Russia, remained a formidable power through the 13th and early 14th centuries. It dominated the Rus principalities, extracting tribute and shaping the rise of Moscow. Over time, the Golden Horde's rulers converted to Islam, blending steppe traditions with Islamic governance. Yet internal disputes and pressure from emerging Russian powers gradually weakened it. By the 15th century, it fractured into smaller khanates, such as Kazan, Crimea, and Astrakhan. Meanwhile, the Ilkhanate in Persia, established by Hulagu, initially ruled as foreign conquerors, but gradually assimilated into Persian society. Under Genghis Khan, r. 1295 to 1304, the Ilkhans converted to Islam and reformed administration, bringing stability. However, after his successors, the state declined rapidly, fragmenting by the mid-14th century into rival dynasties. The Chagatai Khanate, located in Central Asia, occupied a crucial crossroads of trade. Its rulers struggled to balance steppe traditions with Islamic culture, leading to frequent internal strife. Some rulers converted to Islam, while others clung to shamanism or Buddhism, causing deep divisions. The Khanate often broke into eastern and western halves, vulnerable to invasions and rebellions. Yet from this turmoil emerged figures like Tamerlane, Timur, who claimed descent from the Mongols and built his own empire in the late 14th century, reviving the spirit of steppe conquest. Each of these khanates carried forward parts of the Mongol legacy, but also reflected the limits of Mongol unity. What had once been a single empire under Genghis Khan was now a family of competing states, tied by heritage, but divided by geography, culture, and ambition. The fall of the Yuan Dynasty in 1368 to the Ming marked the end of Mongol rule in China, but Mongol power did not disappear entirely. The Yuan court retreated north to Mongolia, where they continued to call themselves the Northern Yuan and claimed legitimacy as successors of Genghis Khan. However, without the wealth and administrative machinery of China, they were reduced to steppe rulers once again. Their influence waned as the Ming dynasty grew stronger, pushing Mongol forces back into the grasslands. By the 15th century, the Northern Yuan were fragmented into rival clans, lacking the unity of earlier generations. Across Eurasia, the Mongol legacy was fading. The Golden Horde splintered, the Ilkhanate dissolved, and the Chagatai Khanate disintegrated. Yet the Mongols had left a permanent mark. Their conquests reshaped political boundaries, destroyed old empires, and created new powers. Their promotion of trade and cultural exchange during the Pax Mongolica left lasting connections between East and West. Even as their khanates collapsed, the memory of Mongol might endured, inspiring later conquerors such as Timur and influencing the political culture of Russia, Persia, and China. The fragmentation of the Mongol Empire was not sudden but gradual, the natural outcome of ruling over too vast and diverse a realm. From the steppes of Mongolia to the cities of Baghdad and Beijing, the Mongols have been both destroyers and builders, conquerors and assimilators. By the late 14th century, The empire that Genghis Khan had forged through fire and blood no longer existed as a single entity. Yet its legacy survived, woven into the histories of the nations it had once dominated. The age of Mongol world conquest was over, but the echoes of their empire would shape Eurasia for centuries to come. The Mongols are often remembered as warriors who destroyed cities and slaughtered populations, but their legacy in governance is equally significant. Across Eurasia, they introduced systems that reshaped the way empires were ruled. One of the most lasting contributions was the idea of meritocracy. From the earliest days of Genghis Khan, loyalty and ability mattered more than noble lineage. This principle spread throughout their empire, allowing individuals of humble origin, Persian administrators, Chinese scholars, or even foreign artisans, to rise to positions of authority. The Mongols also created one of the most efficient communication systems of the medieval world, the Yam, a network of relay stations stocked with fresh horses and provisions. Messages, intelligence reports, and trade goods could travel astonishingly fast across thousands of miles. This system not only strengthened the empire, but also laid foundations for more connected governance in future states. Taxation under Mongol rule was harsh, but it was systematic. Instead of arbitrary exactions, censuses were conducted to calculate tribute fairly, at least by Mongol standards. Conquered peoples were classified, their resources tallied, and tribute assigned. In Persia, this meant the rebuilding of irrigation networks. In China, the establishment of centralized fiscal structures. In Russia, the development of tribute-collecting systems that would later be inherited by Moscow. The Mongols also practiced religious tolerance on a scale rare for their age. While they could be ruthless toward enemies, they allowed conquered populations to practice their faiths freely, provided they paid taxes and remained loyal. Buddhist monasteries, Christian churches, Islamic mosques, and Jewish synagogues all coexisted under Mongol protection. This pragmatic tolerance encouraged cooperation and reduced resistance, ensuring stability in a diverse empire. These practices revealed the duality of Mongol rule, brutal in conquest, but surprisingly adaptive and innovative in administration. The Mongol military was the most formidable fighting force of its time, and its legacy shaped warfare for centuries. At the core of their success was mobility. Mongol warriors were expert horsemen, capable of riding for days without rest, sustaining themselves on mare's milk and dried meat. Each soldier maintained multiple horses, allowing for rapid movement and endurance. This mobility allowed them to outflank and encircle much larger armies, striking with speed that stunned opponents. The Mongols perfected the composite bow, a weapon of extraordinary range and power that could pierce armor at distances where enemy projectiles were ineffective. Combined with disciplined formations, these bows made Mongol cavalry lethal. Equally important were their tactics of feigned retreat, ambush, and encirclement. Enemies who pursued retreating Mongols often found themselves lured into traps and annihilated. Beyond tactics, the Mongols integrated siege warfare into their arsenal. From Chinese engineers, they learned the use of catapults, trebuchets, and even early gunpowder weapons. No city was safe. From Samarkand to Kaifeng, the Mongols demonstrated that they could overcome even the strongest fortifications. Their armies were also organized with ruthless efficiency, structured into decimal units, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, ensuring discipline and coordination. The impact of Mongol warfare extended far beyond their empire. European knights who faced them in Hungary and Poland realized the limits of heavy cavalry against highly mobile archers. Muslim powers like the Mamluks adapted their tactics after Ain Jalut, learning to counter Mongol strategies. Even centuries later, military thinkers studied Mongol campaigns for lessons in logistics, speed, and psychological warfare. By terrifying enemies into surrender, the Mongols demonstrated that fear itself could be a weapon. In short, the Mongols revolutionized medieval warfare, setting standards for mobility, organization, and innovation that reshaped the global military landscape. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Mongol Empire was its role in connecting the world. Through conquest and administration, they created a framework in which goods, people, and ideas moved more freely than ever before. This cultural exchange defined the era of the Pax Mongolica. Chinese inventions such as printing, gunpowder, the compass, and papermaking spread westward, transforming societies in the Islamic world and eventually Europe. Islamic astronomy, mathematics, and medicine traveled eastward, influencing Chinese and Central Asian scholarship. The Persian art of miniature painting blended with Mongol traditions, while Mongol patrons supported Buddhist monasteries, Islamic scholars, and even European travelers. Cities like Samarkand, Tabriz, and Khanbalik, Beijing, became cosmopolitan centers where merchants, scholars, and diplomats from across the world met. The Mongols also facilitated the spread of languages. The Uyghur script influenced Mongol writing, while Persian became the administrative language of the Ilkhanate and Turkic languages flourished under the Golden Horde. These linguistic shifts shaped the identities of entire regions for centuries. Yet cultural exchange also had darker consequences. The very trade networks that linked East and West enabled the spread of the Black Death in the mid-14th century, devastating populations from China to Europe. Still, even in catastrophe, the interconnectedness forged by the Mongols highlighted how deeply the world had become tied together under their rule. The Mongols were not creators of culture in the traditional sense. They borrowed, adapted, and absorbed, but by uniting Eurasia, they accelerated the mingling of civilizations. Their empire acted as a crucible in which traditions fused, leaving behind a world more connected, dynamic, and globally aware. This legacy of cultural exchange ensured that even after their political power waned, the Mongols' influence on human history endured. The figure of Genghis Khan looms larger than almost any other in world history. To his own people, he was a unifier, the man who forged warring tribes into a single nation and gave them a destiny beyond the steppes. To much of the world, he conquered. However, he was a destroyer, a figure of terror whose name evoked fire and blood. This dual memory has persisted through the centuries, shaping perceptions of the Mongol Empire in different cultures. In the Middle East, chroniclers portrayed him and his descendants as scourges sent by God to punish sinful nations. European monks, hearing of Mongol armies on the march, believed they might be the apocalyptic forces foretold in prophecy. Yet in Mongolia itself, Genghis Khan was remembered not as a monster, but as a lawgiver, a protector of the weak, and a visionary who gave his people identity and purpose. The Yasa, his code of law, symbolized justice, while his vision of loyalty and meritocracy inspired future generations. In the 20th century, as Mongolia sought a modern identity, Genghis Khan was revived as a national hero. His name adorns everything from airports to universities, and his image is celebrated as a source of pride. Internationally, historians now view him more complexly, not merely as a conqueror, but as a shaper of the medieval world who connected distant civilizations. His empire, brutal in its making, also enabled cultural exchange, trade, and communication on a global scale. Thus, the memory of Genghis Khan is layered. He was a destroyer and a builder, a tyrant and a visionary, feared across continents yet revered at home. His enduring legacy lies in how he transformed both the destiny of the Mongols and the history of the world. Though the Mongol Empire fragmented by the late 14th century, its influence never disappeared. In Russia, the legacy of Mongol rule shaped governance for centuries. The tribute system imposed by the Golden Horde taught Moscow the mechanics of centralized power, laying foundations for the Tsarist autocracy that would dominate Russia. In Persia, the Ilkhanate's conversion to Islam and integration with Persian bureaucracy influenced the Safavid and later Islamic empires. In China, the Yuan Dynasty may have fallen, but Mongol innovations in trade, currency, and communication left lasting marks on Ming governance. Beyond specific regions, the Mongols revolutionized how empires were imagined. They showed that mobility, adaptability, and cultural flexibility could sustain vast realms. The Mongols also accelerated the integration of Eurasia, creating patterns of exchange that prefigured the modern global economy. Through the Pax Mongolica, goods and technologies spread farther and faster than ever before. Chinese gunpowder reshaped European warfare. Persian astronomical knowledge enriched Chinese science, and artistic traditions crossed boundaries in unprecedented ways. Even the tragedies associated with Mongol rule, such as the spread of the Black Death, underscore how connected the world had become under their empire. Militarily, their strategies influenced armies for generations, studied by leaders from Timur to Napoleon. Politically, their example of pragmatic governance, balancing tolerance with strict order, inspired later rulers who faced the challenge of managing diverse populations. Culturally, they left a mark on literature, folklore, and memory. From Persian poets lamenting the fall of cities to European legends of unstoppable horsemen from the east. Though the empire itself disintegrated, the Mongols' impact endured, woven into the DNA of Eurasian civilization. The story of the Mongol Empire is one of extremes: creation and destruction, brutality and innovation, fear and admiration. At its heart stands the paradox of Genghis Khan and his descendants. They burned cities to ashes, yet also opened roads for trade and dialogue. They slaughtered populations, yet also practiced religious tolerance on a scale rare for their age. They were conquerors but also connectors, weaving together Eurasia into a single fabric for the first time. The Mongol Empire did not last forever. Like all empires, it fractured under the weight of its own size, diversity, and ambition. Yet the transformations it unleashed could not be undone. The rise of Moscow, the flourishing of Persian Islamic synthesis, the integration of China into global networks, the spread of technologies and ideas, all bear the imprint of Mongol power. Today, historians debate how to judge them. Were they destroyers who set back civilizations, or were they catalysts of progress who accelerated global connections? The truth lies somewhere in between. What cannot be denied is their scale. No empire before or since has united such a vast expanse of humanity under a single system, however briefly. For Mongolia, Genghis Khan remains the father of the nation. For the world, he is a symbol of both terror and transformation. The enduring lesson of the Mongols may be that history is never simple. Greatness and cruelty, innovation and destruction often walk hand in hand. The Mongol Empire reminds us that the forces that shape the world are messy, contradictory, and powerful. Its memory endures not because it was purely glorious or purely tragic, but because it was both a mirror of human potential at its most ambitious and its most brutal. And that brings us to the end of today's journey into the world of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. We've witnessed how nomadic tribes rose to build the largest contiguous empire in history, how their warriors brought fear and fire across continents, and how their rule connected the world through trade, ideas, and cultural exchange. We've also seen their downfall, as overextension, division, and rebellion brought the mighty empire to pieces. The moral of this story is clear. Empires rise through strength, vision, and unity, but they fall when they forget the balance between conquest and governance. Great power can build bridges, but if misused, it can also destroy civilizations. Thank you for joining History Teller YT on this epic 20-part journey. If you enjoyed exploring the Mongol Empire with us, make sure to subscribe, share, and come back for more untold stories of history's greatest empires and forgotten civilizations. Until next time, keep your curiosity alive, because history is not just about the past, it's the mirror of our future.